Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity of being with you. And I'm going to be talking about a subject that perhaps is not a very pleasant subject. But how did I get interested in the whole issue of prostitution and human trafficking? I lived in Victoria in 1984 when the Victorian government legalised prostitution, and within months there were several in-your-face street corner brothels in our suburb. I hadn't engaged in the debate about legalising prostitution because I thought it's not going to affect me. But I realised, hey, it does affect us. Fast forward, 1991, I came to Western Australia, and some years later I was asked to counsel women leaving the sex industry. And that really opened my eyes to the whole issue of what goes on in prostitution. And it also made me aware of the whole issue of human sex trafficking. So I'd like to address that issue of human sex trafficking. Can I just have a show of hands? Hands up all those who think that human sex trafficking is a good thing to have. Okay, we're all agreed that human sex trafficking is a terrible thing. Okay, so we're all on the same page. That's great. Well, how big is the problem of sex trafficking? I had the opportunity to go to Russia in July 2013. I met with the police in St. Petersburg, and they told me a figure which absolutely shocked me. They said that every year 35 to 50,000 young women are trafficked out of Russia. 2% only ever get to return. 35,000, I can't picture that number. But just picture for a moment MH17, you know, the airliner that was shot down over the Ukraine. Imagine two airliners full of Russian young women being shot out of the sky every single week, 52 weeks of the year, and you still don't get to 35,000. That is the extent of the problem. And that's only out of Russia. You've got Estonia and the other eastern countries. You've got African countries and Asian countries that people are trafficked from. So what's been the world's response to this issue of human trafficking? The United Nations developed a protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, and that was adopted in 2000. So the world started to realise that, hey, there's a big problem with human sex trafficking. What is sex trafficking, or trafficking in general? People trafficking is the physical movement of people across and within borders through deception, coercion or force for the purpose of exploiting them when they reach their destination. Pretty simple. That can be for sex, it can be for labour, it can be for organ harvesting, for anything. Are people trafficked into Australia? The big answer is yes. Scarlet Alliance, that's the sex workers front in Australia, they say no, sex trafficking is just not an issue in Australia. Let me tell you, it is a big issue and is a growing issue. The reason that most people are trafficked into Australia is for prostitution, there's some forced labour, and then also forced marriage, mainly in the Islamic communities. When I was in Korea last year on a study tour, the Korean officials said to us, please impress upon the authorities in Australia, we are so concerned at the number of South Korean women being trafficked into the sex industry in Sydney and in Melbourne. I was not aware that that was actually an issue. Got back, Googled it, and sure enough, there have been some prosecutions, but the thing is, it's so difficult for police to actually get a prosecution for human trafficking. What has Australia done? We signed up to that UN protocol in December 2002, and we set up the Transnational Sexual Exploitation Trafficking Team. And they are the team that looks at that and tries to get prosecutions happening. If ever you see anything that would suggest to you that there's perhaps trafficking involved in a restaurant, or somebody sets up a brothel in the house next door to you, the Australian Federal Police are the people to contact and give information to. In 2004 to 2014, the Federal Police investigated 399 cases of suspected trafficking, and in 2012-13, 52 reports led to 29 serious police investigations. In the last financial year, 24 formal investigations were commenced. But since 2004 to 2013, they've only managed to get 16 prosecutions. You see, it's very difficult for police to prove that somebody's actually been trafficked. If somebody comes in across our border with a kilogram of methamphetamine, they've either got it or they haven't got it. Simple. But when a young lady travels into Australia on a student visa or a working holiday visa, nobody notices. That's all fine. There's no problem at the border. Most of the human trafficking that's been investigated has been in Sydney and in Melbourne, where we've had legal prostitution for some time. I want to ask you a simple question. Why are women trafficked? The answer is very simple. Because men buy sex. If men didn't buy sex, there'd be no point in bringing people into this country to service the prostitution market. It's as simple as that. If we could reduce the demand for prostitution, we would turn off the tap to human sex trafficking. That's the reality. How do different countries, jurisdictions deal with the issue of prostitution? Basically, throughout the world, you can divide them up into 4 categories. The first one is prohibition. In other words, every aspect of the prostitution industry is prohibited. And that's the United States, I think except for the state of Nevada, has that approach. So you can prosecute the women, the men, anybody involved in any aspect of prostitution. In actual practice, what happens with that legal system is it's always the women that get prosecuted because they're the easiest ones to target. Others have decided to legalise prostitution. And Victoria was the first one to do that in 1984. New South Wales, Germany, Netherlands are an example of that. Others have gone down the path of so-called decriminalising, which is a little different to legalising. Decriminalising basically means you don't have any rules around it, or virtually none, and it's just treated like any other job. And it's up to the market to decide what happens. The other approach, which was developed in 1999, now known as the Nordic model, was first introduced in Sweden in 1999 and has since been adopted by a number of countries. Norway, Iceland were the first, then Canada, Ireland recently taken it on board, and it's actually an approach that was endorsed by the European Parliament in February 2014. I'm going to take you on a little tour of the world and just show you some of the countries that have adopted these different approaches, except for the prohibition one. I won't take you to the United States, but just look at the other 3. But before I do that, I just want to give you a bit of an idea about what prostitution is really like. Until I began counselling women trying to get out of the sex industry, I had this naive idea that prostitution was simply about men who didn't get enough sex and, well, they paid somebody so they could have sex. But what I actually learned from counselling the women is that prostitution is not so much about sex, but actually about men wanting power over women. Interestingly, something like 80 to 85% of men who go to a prostitute are actually married men or men who are in a live-in sexual relationship with a woman. So it's not that there's no sex happening for them. What drives this is that the men want something that their wives or girlfriends are unwilling to do. And because they're paying a woman to do it, she's got to do what I want because I'm the customer's king. I'm paying, you've got to do what I want you to do. Prostitution is inherently a violent business. That's not to say that every client is violent, but you talk to any woman who's been involved in prostitution for any length of time, they will all tell you that the biggest challenge of being in prostitution is how to keep safe. How to keep safe. There was a major study done across Canada, Colombia, Germany, Mexico, South Africa, Thailand, USA and Zambia, where they interviewed over 800 women in prostitution. 71% said they'd been physically assaulted, 63% had been raped, 89% said that if they thought they could possibly survive without prostitution, they'd be out of there in a flash. The other thing that was most surprising, or not surprising, but is a really important piece of information, is 68% of the women suffered severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, if any of you have friends who've perhaps served in the army in Afghanistan, Iraq, or in Vietnam, who've come back and suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, you will know how debilitating a condition that is. Now, we thank our soldiers for going to Afghanistan, Iraq and all that, and we want to honour them for that. But I would put it to you that prostitution at best can be described as a male entertainment industry. Can we justify maintaining an industry that its workers have such a high incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder? If there was any other industry that had that kind of impact on its workers, we would shut that industry down immediately. We would not tolerate that in our society. Now, we shut down asbestos. Why? Not everybody from working with asbestos dies of asbestosis, but the vast majority are very affected. Some guys worked at Wittenoom mine and lived to be 90. But the fact is the vast majority end up dying in their 30s and 40s. So it is a very, very damaging industry to be working in. Let me take you now then to Victoria. It legalised prostitution in 1984. At the time, I remember it well because we lived there at the time, the police said there's 50 brothels operating in Victoria. We've got to do something about it. We've got to try and control it and try and stop it getting too big. Guess what's happened? Today, there are over 100 legal registered brothels in in Victoria, and would you believe 400 illegal ones. And that's not me saying, that's the Victorian police saying that. That's not to mention escort agency work, not to mention street prostitution. Since legalising prostitution in Victoria, human trafficking has become a major issue. And along with it, because now it's a legal industry, you also get in-your-face advertising. Here you have a petrol pump, service station, a brothel offers you 30 cents off at the petrol barrels if you come to them. I suspect they wouldn't give that voucher to their girlfriend or to their wife to use. Let me take you to the Netherlands, which has an interesting history. The Netherlands are often held up as being sort of the place where the sex industry is so clean and so well organised, and that there's no problems, and we should follow the Netherlands model of legalising it. Well, they made it a legal profession back in 1988, but to this day, there is no course available anywhere in the Netherlands where you can study prostitution. It's the only profession in the Netherlands where there's no training course available, which would suggest to me that it's not a profession. People often say prostitution is the oldest profession. I say no, it's the oldest form of oppression. They made brothels fully legal in October 2000, and that's at the national level, and local governments can decide what sort of rules they want to make for their local area. I'm not going to take you to Amsterdam, the red light district of Amsterdam. I'm going to take you to the city of Utrecht, which is the fourth largest city in the Netherlands. I've been there twice, in 2003, looking at it more from the rehab focus in terms of how to help women get out of prostitution, and in 2009, looking at it more from the law focus. My wife's uncle is a very senior Dutch police officer. He retired last year, and through his good connections, I was able to go out with the police on night patrol for several nights in police uniform, so that people didn't realise that I was a spectator. I was a pretend cop, and so I could see firsthand exactly how it operated. In Utrecht, they have these old canals, and they have barges on there, and you see the gangplanks there, and the women display themselves to varying degrees. The guys drive along the road at the front, and if they see someone that takes their fancy, they park their car, they go across the gangplank, she draws the curtains, they do their business, he comes out, and so it goes. And as we drove down that road, I just got dead end at the back, I started looking at the women and I said, I don't see any Dutch girls here. Because they were all black African, American, big-framed Russian ladies and Asian ladies. And the police officer looked across at me and he said, no self-respecting Dutch girl would do this kind of work, which I thought was a bit of an odd answer. But before I could muster my thoughts and how to respond to that, he told me, he said, we know that 85 to 95% of these women are trafficked women. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. And I said, surely you can send undercover police officers in, pretending to be clients, talk to the girls, and if they say they're there against their will, it's all over, they're free. And he said, we've tried that, it doesn't work. He said, the pimps do that. The pimps, they send their mates in pretending to be undercover cops. They talk to the girls. If the girl says anything, they belt the living daylights out of them. But worse than that, because they're traffic victims, there is an organised crime chain back to their village in Estonia or wherever they've come from. And so word gets passed back along that chain, and the organised crime people, they will murder her mother or father or a brother or a sister. They'll bring back the gory photos and they will show them to the girl concerned and say, you talked, now your mother is dead. And then they go and show those photos to all the other girls that he's got under his control and say, see, she talked. If you talk, you want your mother dead? Just go right ahead. The police officer said, we are faced with a total conspiracy of silence. We cannot beat this problem. And that gave me a lot to think about. And then he said, go and watch the movie Taken. Not sure whether any of you have watched the movie Taken, but the movie Taken is basically two naive American girls coming to Paris. They share a cab ride with this suave-looking chap who says, I'm going the same direction as you. They get dropped off and he keeps going. That night he comes with his mates. They kidnap the girls. They're drugged, raped and forced into prostitution. So much for their lovely holiday in Paris. In the movie, one of the girls gets rescued by her superhero Hollywood dad. The police officer said, the only problem is there's no superhero Hollywood dads who can rescue their daughters. Most are dead within 7 years. Let me take you to Germany, which legalised prostitution. Sadly, Germany is now known as the bordello of Europe. Bordello is just a fancy word for brothel. Germany now has something like 400,000 women working as prostitutes. 65 to 80%, the police tell me, are foreigners. And they tell me that, off the record, that when they say foreigners, that really means trafficked people or pimp people. Somebody who's milking them for all the money that they can get out of them. And you get this gaudy in-your-face advertising. In Germany, there's considerable disquiet about their prostitution laws. Der Spiegel, that's similar like a Time magazine, but German language one, it's fairly highly regarded. They ran a series of 5 articles back in 2013 where they did an investigative sort of approach to prostitution, and it had the effect of making the public aware of the growing extent of human trafficking. And they also pointed out that not one of the objectives of the 2006 legislation had actually materialised. Because the idea was to make it safer for women, that they could actually earn more and get health insurance and all of that, and none of that has happened. In fact, the police told me if any girl has a work contract, you can always guarantee that she's trafficked, because the brothel owners made her sign it, even though she can't understand a word of German. She signed it saying here she's totally doing this work voluntarily, so that way he can keep himself covered. They also exposed the myth of the autonomous sex worker. The sex industry loves to portray the idea that women in prostitution can earn so much money, they can set themselves up. If they work in the industry for 5 years, they can set themselves up financially for life. Der Spiegel could not find one single woman who fitted that category. Not one. And Germany now has the shame of being the bordello of Europe. As I was born in Germany, can still speak the language reasonably well. I took the opportunity when I was over there for a family visit to talk to the police in Stuttgart. And the gentleman on the right, he's been in charge of enforcing prostitution law for over 20 years in that police district. And he said to me, he said, I know most of the women who've been long-term prostitutes in Stuttgart. And he said, I do not know one that owns her own apartment. So it's a whole myth, this idea that it helps set people up financially. The other thing that the chap in the middle, he's the one who's in charge of fighting organised crime. And he said, what we've found is, since we've legalised prostitution, it's so much harder to actually beat organised crime, because most men, when they go to a brothel, they pay cash. So the brothel becomes the perfect place to launder money from illegal arms deals, from fraud, from illegal gambling, from any kind of smuggling. All of a sudden you've got clean money. You've just got a super profitable brothel. Magic. And then these guys, they make €1 million donation to the Cathedral Rebuilding Fund or something like that, and everybody thinks they're upstanding citizens. And because of that, other business people are very much disinclined to dob those people in, because they always keep giving the benefit of the doubt when they see things that perhaps shouldn't be happening, because they think he's a good guy because he donated €1 million to the Cathedral Rebuilding Fund. So he said, we're fighting organised crime now with one hand tied behind our back. Okay, let me take you to New Zealand now. New Zealand is a country that has decriminalised prostitution, and the Scarlet Alliance, the sex workers group, and largely the front for the sex industry in Australia, they say we should go for the New Zealand model because that works best. Because wherever you go in the world, wherever they've legalised prostitution or decriminalised it, the fact is it massively increases demand, and then you don't have enough desperate women willing to do that work, and so that creates the opportunity for organised crime to move in and do the human trafficking thing. They claim that New Zealand is the exception to that universal rule because of their unique kind of legislation. So I went to New Zealand and spent some time there talking to women in prostitution, people running rehabs and so on, and I learned how this system works. They introduced the Prostitution Reform Act in 2003, which made prostitution legal. What they've done is they've created what they call SOOBs, small owner-operated brothels. What that means is that up to 3 women can set up in the house, in the suburbs, right next to your house, and run a brothel, as long as there's no children present when sex is taking place. However, in New Zealand, if you're an accountant and you just want to work on your own from home, you need a letter from your 2 neighbours that they don't object. You need to get a planning permit from the council that you can do that, and then you can start working from home. But 3 women can set up a brothel in the house next door to you. They don't need to tell anybody. So basically what's happened in New Zealand is they've pushed the prostitution industry out into the suburbs. Nobody keeps any record of anything, and so it's very easy to say it has an increased demand because nobody's looking where the demand actually is being met. I met with a lady who'd been out of prostitution for just a couple of weeks in New Zealand, and also one who'd been out of the industry for over 10 years. They took me for a walk down through downtown Auckland and showed me some of the brothels. Very much in your face because it's all legal now. Street prostitution, they say, has massively increased. My son has a drive-through coffee shop in Auckland, and he's got 2 actually, and it's not uncommon to see women walking through the shopping centre car park trying to pick someone up. It's perfectly legal. The other interesting thing is the Chow brothers, who are referred to in New Zealand as the sex barons, they run big brothels. When I was over there, this was the construction site that these 2 ladies showed me, and they said that's where the Chow brothers are building a 100-room brothel hotel. Now, if you're a business person, why would you be building a 100-room brothel hotel if demand hadn't increased? I would put it to you, they saw there was a real opportunity here. They already have one that a 90-room brothel in Auckland. It was so profitable they decided to build another one. This one actually hasn't proceeded because they're having trouble getting their liquor licence, because in New Zealand, big brothels seen as entertainment venues, and they generally provide alcohol as well, which helps to make them even more profitable. So that one apparently is not proceeding. But let's have a look at what the Prime Minister, John Keys, under whose government this legislation was brought in. He says the argument was that that's the legislation would eliminate all the street workers and underage people, particularly girls, and the reports that we see in places like South Auckland is that it hasn't actually worked. I think it's been marginally successful, if at all. That's not my words, that's the Prime Minister who helped introduce this legislation, looking back saying, hey guys, it didn't work. The Otago University did a study at the request of the government, their conclusion that not one of the objectives of the legislation's been realised. Let me take you to the last country I'm going to take you to, and that's Sweden. Before 1999, in Sweden, there were 500 brothels known to police. 70% of guys in Sweden, like in other Scandinavian countries, said it was okay for a bloke to see a prostitute if that's what he wanted to do. Then there was a kerfuffle about some things in the early 90s, and the Swedish government had a major inquiry into prostitution. They interviewed 200, it's a parliamentary inquiry, and they interviewed 286 women in prostitution in Sweden. And what it revealed was that not one of those women said she actually really wanted to be there. Not one. So this idea that it's a woman's right to sell her body just didn't gel. And in fact, what had happened in the Scandinavian countries was that the feminist movement started changing their tune already quite some time ago. You know, in the 60s and 70s, the feminist movement said it's a woman's right to sell her body. She can do with her body what she likes. How dare anybody tell her what to do with her body? What happened as time progressed in the late 80s, early 90s, the song sheet that the feminists started singing from in the Scandinavian countries was, prostitution is not about the right of a woman to sell her body. It's actually men with money exploiting vulnerable women. Therefore, let's not prosecute women, but let's go after these guys that are exploiting people. And that started to get some traction in the community. Not a lot of traction, but it's certainly got traction in the Swedish Parliament. The Swedish Parliament has more than 50% of its members are actually women. And I think that certainly helped to get this thing moving. So what is the Swedish legislation, now generally referred to as the Nordic Approach? Basically, it sees prostitution as the exploitation of vulnerable women by men, and it says that it doesn't matter how much money a bloke has, he's not entitled to access a woman's body. So what they've done is, their legislation they introduced in 1999 makes it an offence to purchase or attempt to purchase sexual services. It's gender neutral, so a bloke buying a boy, same thing, or for that matter, a woman trying to buy sexual services off a man. And it bans all forms of advertising, anything to do that would facilitate prostitution. What it also does, it provides funding for very well run exit programs. We visited a couple of them. This one's the Skosbo Rehab Centre run by the Salvation Army. And they told us it takes up to 4 years for women to recover from being involved in prostitution. The longer they've been in it, the longer it takes to recover. And they said virtually every single woman that comes into their rehab centre suffers from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. When they passed the law, nothing changed in Sweden because the police couldn't get their head around this legislation. So they actually had to bring in some of the feminists who were the architects of the legislation to train the police, and then things started to happen. They shut down all the advertising, and now they have 2 officers whose job is to trawl the internet looking for the ads, because in Europe, prostitution advertising is all moved, whether it's legal or illegal, it's all moved to the internet. They trawl the internet looking for ads, and then they make a booking, but instead of police going in, they sent social workers, female social workers, to talk to the woman and make her aware that we've got good rehab facilities. 70-80% of the women they find are drug addicts. The rest are generally people in domestically violent relationships. Their partner or boyfriend or whatever is pimping them, that sort of thing. It's very rare that a woman is there thinking this is a fun job. And if the woman chooses not to go into rehab, then they the police stake the place out with undercover police officers, and they grab the guys coming out because they can get permission to from the courts to tap the lady's phone, and so they record all the messages that are on there, and because it's not only an offence to purchase but also to attempt to purchase. So when you've made a booking, that equals attempting to purchase, and they then are issued with an infringement notice. And interestingly, they also provide the men with free counselling. And we went to one of those counselling centres, and the lady that was running that centre said, most of the men that use prostitutes have major personal issues themselves and really a need and help. Sometimes the men, she said, actually say, I'm so glad I got caught because I've been in this cycle for 20 years and now finally I've been able to break out of it. So it's a very interesting side. The other thing is they have in place a person called a National Coordinator Against Prostitution and Human Trafficking for Sexual Exploitation. His job is to make sure that every government department does their utmost to reduce prostitution and human trafficking. Patrick Sedeloff, I've met him a couple of times now. He's had that job since 1999 and he reports directly to Parliament. So no government department wants to be named in his report. And so they work very effectively together. Like, for example, you can't always shut down a business just because somebody said, well, there's prostitution going on in there. Often it's like Thai massage places where people are offered a happy ending at the end of their massage. And often guys, when they've been there now, culture's so changed in Sweden, they actually ring the police and say, hey, I was offered a happy ending. And that's not enough basis for the police to do a raid. But then they put covert cameras up together with the tax office and they count the number of customers going in. And at the end of a week or a fortnight, they do a raid on the books of the business. And a lot of these places are shonky and they put all their money through the till. They don't put it through the books. So they shut the premises down for tax evasion. Simple. So they're very creative in how they tackle it. Now, not everybody's enamoured with the Nordic approach. Scarlet Alliance and the sex industry, they don't want this Nordic legislation because the effect it's had in Sweden is that prostitution has just absolutely almost collapsed. There's very little demand for prostitution. There still is. I mean, you'll never eliminate prostitution by any legislation. It's like domestic violence. No matter what laws we make, there'll always be some level of domestic violence. But the society's basically said in Sweden, prostitution is unacceptable in a modern society. And so the result is that Sweden has the lowest sex trafficking of any country in Europe, has the smallest prostitution industry of any country on a per capita basis of any country in Europe. So European countries actually now looking to Sweden and Norway, which adopted the same legislation, and Iceland, and saying, hey, perhaps we ought to be going down that track. But detractors come up and they say, no, it's not as good as what it sounds. All it's done is they say it's pushed prostitution underground. The police in Sweden said to me, if the customers can find it, we can as well. We're not that different to customers. We know how to use the internet. We know how to use mobile phones. It's as simple as that. Some people in Sweden, they still say it's a woman's right to sell her body. But I would put it to you, have you ever met a 14 or a 16 or a 17-year-old girl who thinks, wouldn't it be fun to have sex with 15, 20 blokes a day? I've never met one yet. Have you? I'm sure you haven't. So the reality is it's not about a woman's right to sell her body, but it's actually about men with money exploiting vulnerable women. Others have said, it's going to increase the incidence of rape. Well, it has not had that effect in any of the countries that have adopted it. Because keep in mind, 85% of the people who visit prostitutes are married men or in a sexual relationship with a woman, so that simply doesn't stack up. Others say, well, give us the hard, cold statistics that it's actually worked. Well, the difficulty is nobody actually knows how many women were working in prostitution before 1999. That's true, because it's a clandestine industry. If you ask the police today, how many prostitutes are there in Perth? They said, wouldn't have a clue. Nobody really knows. But the anecdotal evidence is certainly there that the prostitution has very much declined in Sweden, and I would put it to people who say, well, you can't prove that it's been effective. I said, well, I can tell you one thing, though, that legalising it has been a total disaster. It's just led to massive increase in demand, which has led to human trafficking. Look at Sweden. I can't prove that the Nordic model is 100% effective. No, it's not 100% effective. It hasn't eliminated prostitution, but it's shrunk the industry massively, and it's made human sex trafficking, very uninteresting for organised crime. In fact, the Swedish police say that a number of organised crime organisations have actually moved out of Sweden because it's too hard to do business there now. The tide is turning in Europe. Legalising that they did in Germany and Netherlands is widely seen as an abject failure. And in Europe, the feminist movement has started following the Scandinavian one and saying, hey, it's not about a woman's right to sell her body. And they see very much that prostitution is a gender equality issue. They say we cannot have gender equality while we have prostitution in our society. Remember the barges I showed you in Utrecht? The mayor of Utrecht had those shut down. He said, I refuse to be mayor of a city where we know that 85 to 90% of the women here are trafficked women. So they shut the whole thing down. And I think that's fantastic. The European Parliament in February 2014, seeing the effectiveness of the Nordic approach in Sweden and Norway and Iceland, urged all member states to tackle the demand side of prostitution and asked them to consider the Nordic model. And notice it says that part of the motion was that prostitution violates human dignity and human rights, whether it's forced or voluntary. Canada, just in November 2014, adopted the Nordic approach to prostitution because they needed to change their legislation. The public was so supportive of going down that path, the government headed down that path. Ireland, in October last year, passed the Nordic type legislation, and again, because the public and the MPs, looking at the situation worldwide, decided that was the way to go. It's interesting, not one country in the last 10 years has legalised prostitution. Any country that's actually changed its legislation has adopted the Nordic approach. So what's the solution to human sex trafficking? I would hope I've demonstrated to you that the way forward is to reduce the demand for prostitution, reduce the demand for women, and by penalising men who buy vulnerable women's or boys' body, that's the way forward. And we need to change our culture. We need to get the message across that sex is not a market commodity. Sex is something that's very intimate, and it's about relationship. And we need to re-educate our offenders, and we need to teach boys and men to respect women. So you can be part of the solution. One is be informed about the whole subject, and hopefully by listening to this talk today, you have been informed. Be ready to counter the fallacious arguments that are often put out there for legalising prostitution. And you can also, here in Western Australia, join the grassroots campaign to have the Nordic legislation adopted here. And when you have the opportunity, talk to your friends, to your circle at church, your service clubs, wherever you are, and tell your MPs that you think this is the way forward. And a little while back, some concerned citizens, together with me, formed a little group called Adopt Nordic WA Incorporated. And if you would like to get email updates on what we're doing, all you need to do is go to our website, which is adoptnordicwa, or one word, .org, and you can put your email address and things in there, and then we'll send you updates of what's happening and how you can be involved. Thank you very much for your attention. Would some of you perhaps have a few questions you'd like me to answer? Yes?
In the Perth context, I hear anecdotally that the FIFO industry is quite a big issue in relation to prostitution and the human trafficking. Are they going to, is that true, is what I've heard? And if so, is the mining industry going to be particularly targeted in terms of education should this sort of stuff go forward, which I hope it does. I think it's fantastic what you're advocating for.
Look, in the northwest, the so-called FIFO towns like Karratha, Port Hedland and so on, there is a definite issue with prostitution. There's no question about that. And I believe that this model of legislation, by going after the men and not after the women who've been conned into coming here on student visas or tourist visas or whatever, on some promise of something, that we don't go after them, but we go after the men. And I think that will be very, very effective. There is definitely an issue around prostitution with the FIFO lifestyle. Sure.
Yeah, my husband used to be FIFO, and then so he told me some of the stories that came out of there. The problem being is a lot of them are not visiting prostitutes' house here because it's expensive. They're now going overseas for their holidays, and they're targeting the girls in places like the Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand, where they're going. Would it be more effective in some sense to have a stronger education policy against perhaps the prostitution?
Yeah. Look, I think there's no question about it that people, sex is so cheap in Thailand and Cambodia, and child sex is readily available in those places, and I think what Sweden is looking, I think they've actually implemented it already, I'm not 100% sure on that, is that if you purchase or attempt to purchase sexual services overseas, you can be prosecuted by the Swedish law enforcement agency for having purchased sex overseas. So that kind of sends the message that, hey, if you go across the border and we find out about it, you're going to be in trouble. So I think the more countries that do that, the better that will be. But look, I think if people were aware of the nature of prostitution and the fact that so many women are trafficked into this country to be in prostitution, I think that would help to also reduce demand. It's interesting, in Sweden, when the legislation was introduced, 70% of men thought it was okay for a man to visit a prostitute. When I was there last year, a recent public opinion survey showed that only 30% of men now thought it was okay. So it's a massive cultural shift in the space of just a decade or more.
Peter, is there movement in other states regarding this sort of change?
There is an organisation called NORMAC, Nordic, I should know, Australia Coalition, I think it's called. They started in Tasmania, now based more in Victoria, but we work in close association with them. But I believe that West Australia, because we're geographically isolated from the rest of the states of Australia, if we can implement this program, this kind of legislation here in Western Australia, and if we can demonstrate that this actually works well, it'll be then much easier to convince states like Victoria and New South Wales, which have got used to a legal industry, that, hey, this is actually a much better way to go. So if you say try to do it in Victoria and New South Wales, where you've got towns on either side of a border, it would be just so easy for people to kind of bypass the situation. But Western Australia, we're so separated geographically, I believe we've got a real opportunity to be at the forefront of social reform in this country. Andre?
So have you shared that with your members of your parliament and with the opposition, and what are the obstacles?
The biggest obstacle is that many people still think that, well, if a woman wants to sell her body, who am I to tell her that she can't? That's still the biggest obstacle. The feminist movement here in Australia still sings off that song sheet. They still have not embraced the European approach, which is, hang on a minute, it's not about a right to sell your body, but it's about men with money exploiting vulnerable women. In terms of some of my MPs, the ones that I thought initially I'd approach first, because I thought perhaps because of their character they might be more sympathetic. The general reaction has been, why hasn't somebody thought of this earlier? This sounds a great way forward. I have spoken to the Attorney General and run him through some of this, and he's a little hesitant because he says, well, I've had women come to my office to say that they enjoy their job, and prostitution, why should government tell them they can't do what they enjoy? And so he's reluctant to go down that path. But I believe that if we can get like happened in Canada, a grassroots movement happening, that this is what we want, I believe we can get it across the line eventually.
Just with this, what was I going to say? For those that are in prostitution, I've noticed that it's like a real fear-based culture, and people don't feel like they can get out because you know, work's not an opportunity and things. And I know in Cambodia, because I've just got back from there, they do have resources to kind of facilitate that, but it's not big enough to actually like generate more people to come out of prostitution. So with Nordic, I know that you said they go into rehab and things like that, but what about income? How do they...
Yeah, it's residential care. So basically, what happens is when they go into that in Sweden, they get a living allowance, some pocket money, but it's residential. So their food, clothing, everything else is fully taken care of. And then as they're able to start looking after themselves, they learn how to shop again and do all those kinds of things. And as they move forward, so it costs a lot of money. To rehabilitate a person, to have someone in residential rehab for 3-4 years, that's a lot of money. But the alternative is, which is happening here in Australia, is that most women who've been in prostitution for any length of time, they see their days out on the invalid pension. And that costs the taxpayer a bucket load of money. Have a person from age, say, 30, 35, they live to be 70, all those years on the invalid pension, that costs a fortune. And that's purely financial side, but I think there's also the human aspect that if we can rehabilitate the person to rejoin mainstream society, I think we have a moral obligation to facilitate that as best as we possibly can. Well, thank you very much for your interest, and I hope that many of you will visit the website and put your name and email there, and we'll be able to keep you informed of what's happening. Thank you very much.